So in this lecture, we're going to focus on the viral diseases of the skin. And many of these are going to be systemic in nature, but their signs and symptoms primarily manifest in the skin, which is why they're in this chapter. So there's a group of viruses called the pox viruses, most of which affect animals, but some can also affect humans. Now, smallpox is exclusively a disease of humans. We'll talk a little bit about that one. Orf is pox virus of sheep and goats. Cowpox, of course, for cattle, and then Mpox is what we currently call monkeypox, which affects non-human primates primarily, but can also affect humans. And we've actually seen an increase in Mpox over the past decade, partly because of an increase in exotic pet trade. So we're just bringing the virus closer to humans when we bring those animals in from the wild. And also, we no longer routinely vaccinate for smallpox, and that vaccine actually provided some protection against Mpox. And so smallpox is a really ancient disease, but it's also the first one that we have declared eradicated. So as of 1980, the World Health Organization, after a very concerted effort for a couple of decades of doing what's called ring vaccination. So essentially, every new case that was identified, they would go to where that person lived, and then going out 50 miles in every direction from that person's home, they would vaccinate every person they came in contact with, and that's what they refer to as ring vaccination. So eventually, if you do that for every new case that pops up, you can eventually essentially vaccinate everyone and break the cycle, because smallpox, there are no animal reservoirs and there are no environmental reservoirs. And so that's only possible when you have a disease that is exclusively in humans. And so even though we've eradicated it from human reservoirs, there are still frozen vials of the virus stored. There are two known sources, one at the CDC in Atlanta and one in Russia in their equivalent of the CDC. And so there was a time where the scientific community basically believed that those stores of virus should be destroyed if this infection was no longer found in the human population. If we get rid of the actual virus in storage, then we could truly get rid of the possibility of disease. However, some scientists believe that if that virus was ever turned into a biological weapon, we would need the virus on hand to then make new vaccine. And so there was a big push to not destroy the virus. Of course, now we have new technology to make vaccines that may not be as strong of an argument anymore. But this disease was in fact eradicated from the human population. So the pox viruses, so this would be, for example, the smallpox. If you had a patient that had smallpox, you would see a variety of types of rash, basically, because each spot goes through a series of stages. So you can see there's the macule, which is sort of flat and flush with the skin, and it's non-itchy red spots. And then as it builds fluid, it would be referred to as a vesicle that would crust over, and then it would become a papule, a pustule, and then finally a scar. And so again, it was very disfiguring. So this was a disease that if you survived, you more than likely were left with scars all over your body, which is why, if you recall from chapter 1, the story of the milkmaids, basically, because they had direct intimate contact with the cattle and got exposed to cowpox, which was a very mild form of the disease, and it essentially allowed them to create memory and protected them against the smallpox virus. So smallpox was actually caused by a couple of different viruses, so what we call the variola viruses, or the orthopox virus family. And so there are two forms. What we called variola major was the more virulent form, and this one killed about 1 in 3. And then there was variola minor, which was much milder. In fact, they thought it was a different disease because it was so much milder than true smallpox, and they used to call that alistrim. And so highly infectious because it is a respiratory droplet transmission. And so if you just inhaled the virus, and where the virus came from is very oftentimes when you have smallpox, those scabs that we were just looking at on the skin would also form inside the mouth and the throat. And so when someone coughs or speaks, those viruses then were released in respiratory droplets. Now those scabs, as they form and shed, also contain the virus, which is why and that virus remained viable for long periods of time. So this is how they believe it came to the New World. For example, Columbus and other explorers, as they brought over clothes and blankets and things, if they shared those with the native population that had never been exposed to smallpox, those viruses that were in the scabs, that were in the blankets from people who had had smallpox would then be transmitted that way. And so highly infectious, and which version of the disease you got partly depended on which virus you got exposed to, but also on your own immune response. And so recall this idea of a cytokine storm. If your immune system overreacted to the virus, then it would be more severe. So there are four basic clinical forms, what they called the varioloid rash, which was the very mildest form, the flat hemorrhagic smallpox, sometimes called black pox, because you would get necrotic areas of the body, and this one was 100% fatal. So if you got that particular version of it, probably did not survive. What they called classical ordinary smallpox was where you had very discrete scab forming and scar forming on the skin. So this one, while it had a high survival rate, it typically left lifetime of scars. And what they called the confluent type, which was also highly fatal, is because those scabs, instead of just being individual pustule areas, they would actually sort of merge together, and you would have descriptions of patients where they had this confluent type of smallpox where you just have giant sheets of skin peeling off of the body because all of those lesions essentially would merge together. And there's a book called Demon in the Freezer, and it talks all about those residual viruses that they have in storage in those labs, but it also describes in great detail the last few known cases of smallpox, where they kind of walk through all of the symptoms in great detail. So treatment and prevention, obviously it's viral, so there's no treatment, but essentially if you were exposed and diagnosed, then they would immediately vaccinate against the virus to try to stem the long-term scarring. And so routine vaccination against this organism discontinued in 1972. So even, within a decade of eradicating the disease worldwide in the U.S., we stopped vaccinating. So we now have several generations of people that don't have any protection against smallpox. So this is one of those diseases that is at the top of the list of concern for biological weapons, and partly because we've stopped vaccinating against it. Then we have another group, the herpes viruses, and this is a huge family of viruses. There are more than 100 different strains, but some of them specifically affect the skin. So we're going to talk about the herpes simplex viruses, which generally get grouped into type 1 and type 2. And their virulence factor is primarily the ability to form syncytia. So recall that when a virus gets into a host cell, it replicates and then it bursts out, typically into the interstitial spaces. But herpes viruses are able to just cause the neighboring cells to fuse together, and so the new virions essentially burst into the neighboring cell, and then they replicate some more, and then they burst into the other neighboring cells. So this basically allows it to hide from the immune system fairly readily. And And so because these are DNA viruses, they can also insert themselves in the host cell DNA and remain there as a latent virus. So there's the saying, herpes is forever, and this is why, because those viruses will permanently set up camp. Now, whether they recur and you see multiple lesions over the lifetime has a lot to do with your immune system, whether it keeps it in check or not. And so that syncytia is what basically causes those lesions, right? So when you think of like a cold sore, where you have the lesion that forms and it sort of spreads into neighboring areas, that's basically what you're seeing, is as those syncytia form and become very large, sort of unwieldy, very weak cells, they eventually burst and they are full of virus. So those lesions are highly infectious. But those viruses can also migrate and show up in other body locations from where they initially set up camp. So you can have ocular herpes, you can have genital or oral herpes. So typically when we think of oral herpes, we're talking about cold sores, fever, blisters, there's a lot of names for them. But basically they're going to reoccur under forms of stress. So that might be, just literal stress, or it could be even just exposure to UV could reawaken those viruses. So some people get cold sores every time they go and get a sunburn, essentially. You can also have a form of herpes virus infection called a whitlow, and this is essentially that syncytia is forming. It's just that the skin of the fingers is very thick, so it's a little harder for those lesions to burst. But typically these form on the upper limbs, so in the fingers primarily. And these are, again, just raging with virus. So this is important that if you are a healthcare worker or if you have contact with an infant, a neonate, that you should not handle that baby if you have an active whitlow, because it can be very dangerous for an infant. So again, the herpes simplex viruses have a high affinity for nerve cells, which is also partly why it's a lifelong infection, because nerve cells are amitotic, right? They are some of the longest lived cells in the body. And so herpes simplex 1 tends to have a higher affinity for the trigeminal nerve, and so this is how it ends up. It's either ocular herpes if it travels down the ophthalmic branch, or the mandibular maxillary branches would be how fever blisters or cold sores form. If it gets into the brachial ganglia, then it can then become a whitlow, but herpes simplex 2 has a higher affinity for the sacral ganglia, which is why that is typically associated with genital herpes. So transmission is via direct contact with those infected mucous membranes of either the mouth or the genitals, so it can be sexually transmitted. And in adults, these infections are not life-threatening, but in a neonate, they can be fatal. And so recall that the acronym TORCH represents those diseases that can cross even in a healthy, intact placenta. That H is for herpes. Recall that HIV is also transmitted across the placenta, but it is under the O for other. This H represents the entire family of herpes infections. So not only can it cross the placenta, but it can also be transmitted during the birthing process through the birth canal. And so diagnosis is fairly simple. Just the visible lesions are pretty characteristic, but there are immunoassay tests that they can use to confirm simplex 1 or simplex 2, or just the presence of the herpes simplex viruses. So, of course, there are no treatments that actually cure herpes infections because the virus is permanently ingrained into the DNA of the host cells. But we do have antiviral drugs that can control outbreaks. So things like Zovirax and acyclovir. But in some people, they have found that lysine supplements, this is just an amino acid, but if you have a consistent use of lysine, it can actually suppress those outbreaks, sometimes better than those antiviral drugs. And so prevention, of course, just avoiding contact with infected individuals. And this is easiest probably during, having an open active lesion on the face that's very obvious, and that's really when you have the highest risk of spreading the virus, is when you have those active open lesions. But it's a little harder to avoid for genital lesions because they may be, especially in females, are internal and not so obvious. But so safe sex is obviously a primary way to prevent that as far as the genital herpes goes. So here's sort of just a compare and contrast here between herpes simplex 1 and simplex 2. So again, they tend to be sometimes named the above the waist herpes is herpes simplex 1 and the below the waist for herpes simplex 2. But there are other forms as well. So for example, herpes simplex 1 can also form out on the open skin. There's a variety, what they call herpes gladiatorium, which is typically associated with wrestling, which is how they gave it the name. So you have these big wrestling conferences or competitions, and there's a lot of direct contact between skin, and so sometimes those competitions, they get a rash of outbreaks after one of those competitions because people have exposed lesions that are coming in contact. And then of course we have, again, this is a huge family of viruses. Many of these we will hear about in either this or other lectures as we go. So what we call human herpes 3 is actually the varicella zoster virus, which is what causes chickenpox and shingles. Human herpes virus 4 is the Epstein-Barr virus, which is the cause of mono. Human herpes virus 5 is CMV, or cytomegalovirus. We'll hear about that one in the next lectures. And then 6 and 7, they actually believe are probably actually the same strain, but they got named separately, is what they called sixth disease or roseola, which again is really just a rash and fever disease of infants typically. Human herpes 8 is the virus that we learned about when we talked about the oncogene theory. So recall Kaposi's sarcoma is a cancer of the blood vessels, and so very oftentimes this is something that is a secondary problem to HIV infection. So when HIV comes along, knocks back your immune system, if this secondary herpes virus comes along, it can cause that cancer. So recall your oncovirus if they multiple hits. So sometimes it requires more than one hit to the DNA. So this is also a herpes virus. And then another viral disease of the skin are warts, and a lot of people misidentify this as a fungal disease because they do sort of look like little growths on the skin, mushroom-like growths, but these are actually viral infections. So there's a huge family of what we call the papillomaviruses, and human papillomavirus, or HPV, is the primary cause here. So again, there are multiple strains. We're going to talk a lot more about papillomavirus when we get to the reproductive chapter and talk about genital warts. There are certain strains that are preferentially going to affect those tissues, but primarily when we're talking about the skin chapter, we're talking about those common or seed warts, plantar warts, which show up on the plantar surface of the foot, and then flat warts that can form pretty much anywhere. So all of them have generally the same treatments, which is just trying to physically remove them from the surface of the body. So freezing, surgical treatments or chemical treatments, and you really have to go deep under the skin to get to what they typically refer to as a root, but there's really it's just really trying to get to the cells where the viruses have permanently embedded themselves in the DNA, and sometimes that can be fairly deep. So sometimes warts recur because they didn't go deep enough when they go to remove those, but typically the chemical treatments are really highly concentrated forms of salicylic acid, which is just aspirin. So you may have heard the old wives' tale where if you just put an aspirin under a Band-Aid and put it on top of the wart and just replace it until the wart is gone, that's really that's what Dr. Scholl's treatments are. It's just really concentrated salicylic acid. They're just formulated to be absorbed a little bit more readily than an aspirin. um, and so again, because these are just like herpes viruses in the sense that they embed themselves into the DNA, they will be a latent infection and could just create new warts over time. And so transmission, just direct contact, but also can be transmitted through fomites, so sharing shoes, but primarily it's direct contact. And then the herpes virus 3, which again is also known as the varicella virus or the varicella zoster virus. This is the cause of shingles and chickenpox. So this one is highly contagious and primarily spread through respiratory droplets. And of course, because it has an incubation period where there are no symptoms, those respiratory droplets become a ready source of the virus, and so easily transmitted. And again, most of the time when you have a disease that has an incubation period with no symptoms and it's spread by respiratory droplets, those are the most difficult to get a handle on in a community, which is why those are the ones we tend to vaccinate against. And so you can have a couple of weeks of asymptomatic period where you're highly contagious. And so the primary sign and symptom is the characteristic rash. So in chickenpox, you tend to get the red rash that pretty much forms all over the body. But in shingles, if it recurs later in life as shingles, you get this characteristic rash that basically the virus will set up in the sacral nerve, and that's why you tend to get shingles along that dermatome of the trunk, and it tends to be asymmetrical, so you tend to get it just on one side of the body. But again, these viruses can set up in the DNA of nerves pretty much anywhere. So you can get shingles in the eye, you can get it pretty much anywhere on the body. It just tends to most commonly be associated with the trunk. Now, transmission, you can also get direct contact with the rash. But if it's your first exposure, you won't. If you were to touch a shingles rash and never had chickenpox, you would get chickenpox. You wouldn't get shingles. If someone has chickenpox and you get exposure to the rash, you would get chickenpox. So again, chickenpox is the initial infection. Shingles is what your body, what happens later in life as a recurring infection. And so susceptibility, if you've never had it or you were not vaccinated against it, then you are highly susceptible. Most humans are susceptible to chickenpox. And so about 1 in 3 people who had chickenpox will get shingles at some point in their life, right? So again, if you had chickenpox, the virus is in your body. It's whether your immune system keeps it in check or not, whether you get shingles. And so why we tend to see shingles in older patients is because it does have to do with the immune system. So as we age or have other conditions, so chronic stress, cancer treatments, HIV, anything that affects the immune system will increase your risk of getting shingles. And there's also pretty long-term data that shows about 15% of people that get shingles will also have a long-term debilitating condition called post-herpetic neuralgia. And so especially those that end up affecting the eye or sometimes the hearing, the vestibulocochlear nerve can have permanent hearing damage and things like that. So it's not just a rash, and the rash is really painful as well. So anything to avoid getting shingles is a good idea. And so prevention today, we do have a vaccine. So this is really fortunate. So even though the chickenpox virus or a case of chickenpox, that rash is fairly mild. Especially the younger the child is, the more mild it is, and it has to do with how mature the immune system is. So if you got chickenpox for the first time in your life in your 20s, you probably had a pretty severe version of it because your immune system was much more mature. And so historically, young kids would get chickenpox and they couldn't go to school. And so historically, where did you send your child when they had chickenpox? If they couldn't go to school, you sent them to grandma's house. And so historically, of course, grandma most likely had chickenpox as a child. And then if she gets exposed to the grandchild, it basically served as a natural booster shot and kept shingles in check in previous generations. Well, now that we have vaccination, so the vaccine came out in about 1995, and they added a booster shot. So as of 2006, they actually have a two-shot series. So most people today are familiar with the two-shot series. Well, since then, the data that they've shown is that about a 90% decrease in cases of chickenpox and shingles based on that vaccine. And so, but in that gap in between, when they first started vaccinating children against chickenpox, they realized that the older generation was no longer getting that natural booster shot because kids weren't staying home with chickenpox anymore. And so there was actually a huge increase in shingles for the first decade or so after that vaccine came out. And so that's why they went ahead and made a vaccine for shingles, because they realized that, you know, just the big picture, that booster shot was no longer available, essentially, the natural one. So that's why we have two versions of the vaccine. So there are a couple of different versions for children. You can have just the chickenpox by itself, or it can be now associated with the MMR vaccine in a quadrivalent vaccine. And then in adults, we have two different versions of the shingles vaccine. So they have been very effective vaccines. And there is a lot of good data that shows if you are someone who gets shingles, if you have an outbreak more than once, then you will probably get it multiple times in your adult life. If you have a female ancestor who got repeated rounds of shingles, then you are about 20% more likely to get shingles yourself. And so these vaccines have been very helpful. And again, this is a viral disease. There are no treatments. All you can do is supportive therapy and pain control for the neuralgia and the painful rash that happens. And we have a few different forms of measles. The mildest form is what we know as rubella, or the German measles, and this is the rubella virus or rubevirus. Also transmitted through respiratory droplets, and there's a fairly long incubation period where you're asymptomatic. So this is another one of those diseases that is hard to get a hold of in a community because it has this long period where people are unaware that they can spread the virus. So this one is characterized by a very mild, very light pink, typically, rash that we refer to as macules. So remember, these are the very flush with the skin, flat rash that is non-itchy, and then you may also have swollen lymph nodes. But where we really worry about rubella is with the developing fetus, because it can cause severe neurological defects. And so historically they called these the congenital rubella infections. But now we understand a little bit better about the progression of disease. What they call congenital rubella syndrome is typically where they lump all of these together. And so this is the leading vaccine preventable cause of birth defects. This is one of the main reasons why back in the 50s so many women aborted babies if they got rubella while they were pregnant, because it was almost a guarantee that the baby would have lifelong neurological problems. So the most susceptible, of course, are those that have not been vaccinated, but more importantly, an unborn fetus. So if a mother was not vaccinated before pregnancy, then her fetus is highly susceptible. And so there's no treatment, just supportive therapy, depending on the symptoms. But we do have a very effective vaccine. So this is the R in the MMR vaccine that is a routine vaccine in this country. And so because it is a live attenuated vaccine, pregnant women, if they've not been exposed or if they've not had the disease themselves, they've not been vaccinated, should not receive that vaccine because it can cross the placenta. Recall, this is the R in torch. Um, uh, Again, that can affect the fetus, and that vaccine, if it's a live attenuated vaccine, could revert to a virulent form, just like other live vaccines. So you can definitely see how effective this vaccine has been once it came on the market in the late 60s. And so we went from 40, 50,000 cases a year down to now we're literally in the single digits. But again, this is one of those diseases that is not necessarily vaccinated all around the world. And so with global travel, you could still have people get exposed. So that's why we vaccinate against it. And then we have the more um, uh, virulent form of measles, which is the red measles or rubeola. Sometimes they call this the English measles. And this one's name is the rubeola virus or the morbillivirus. And I always look at that prefix morbilla as in higher morbidity, right? So it's the more dangerous of the two. And this one is much more contagious than rubella. It is also spread through respiratory droplets. And then once it gets into the respiratory tract, it can spread through the lymph and the blood through to other organ systems. And this one also can cross the placenta. So this is another disease that we worry about the unborn fetus as well as the adult. And so this one can cause quite a few lifelong problems with either vision or heart problems. It can also cause spontaneous abortion, and now they're finding that it can also find its way to the gonads in the male, so in the testes, and as adults they can be it can cause sterility. So that's one that it took a long time to make that link that it was actually a measles infection as a child that led to an adult having sterility problems. And again, highly contagious, and you have up to a 12-day incubation period where you're spreading the virus without knowing it. And so here's another viral disease that we don't have any antibiotics, no antivirals available. We just have to let it run its course and provide supportive therapy when necessary. So the virulence factors here, essentially, much like many of the viral diseases we're going to talk about, is it's where your cytotoxic T cells are triggered, which again, that is their job, is to go after virally infected cells, but they tend to come and do excess damage to the tissues. But they can also do something that's very similar to the herpes virus, which is to cause the neighboring cells to fuse together into a syncytia. The main difference between how herpes virus causes a syncytia and measles causing syncytia is that in the measles syncytia, those cells are actually still alive. They just basically are triggered to fuse together. In herpes, those cells fuse together as they die. So that's the primary difference. But at the molecular level, it looks very similar. And they both provide the same kind of protection against the immune system. And so signs and symptoms, a little bit, they start out kind of vague with just fever and sore throat, headache, things like that. But really what's diagnostic is what you're looking at is the back of the throat where those syncytia are forming. You get what are called Koplik's spots. And those are typically diagnostic of this form of measles. And so again, because this can travel to other parts of the body from the respiratory tract, it can cause a variety of problems. And especially again in developing fetus can affect the brain. And so encephalitis is really one of those high risk problems. Now, if it's an HIV/AIDS patient who has limited immune response, then this is actually one of the high mortality secondary infections that kills a lot of the HIV/AIDS patients, so about a 30% mortality rate. I believe tuberculosis is the #1 killer of HIV/AIDS patients. So remember, HIV doesn't kill the patient, it's what comes along after the immune system is no longer capable of fighting off other infections, and this is one of them. So again, the prevention, this is one of the M's. So measles, mumps, and rubella is the MMR. So this is the first M. And you can see again, highly effective vaccine in the case of the measles vaccine. So in 1963 is when it became a routine vaccination in this country. And you can see over time that it has dramatically decreased the number of cases. Now, globally, of course, again, we still have places in the world that don't have routine vaccination against measles. And so you can see here in between about 2019 and 2020, there was a huge increase in cases globally, and some of that actually made its way to the United States. You might remember there were a rash of cases that were identified at Disneyland in, I believe it was 2019. And some of that was travel related. Some of that was anti-vax related. So there were quite a few people who refused to give their children the measles vaccine, and then you get exposed from someone coming from a part of the world where they don't vaccinate against it. Of course, some of these cases were also what we call breakthrough cases. So recall that there's actually what we call a threshold. There is a minimum amount of immunity that needs to be present in a community for diseases to not spread. And so if you're below that threshold, even people who have been vaccinated, recall that vaccines don't work for everyone. You're relying on your immune system actually being able to respond to the vaccine. And so if you have, I believe for measles, the threshold is like 90%. It's a pretty high threshold that we have to maintain. So when you have anti-vax, when you have people that are hesitant against vaccinating their children, then you end up with a pool of susceptible people, and it doesn't take much because of a highly infectious disease like this for people to get exposed and get sick. So you can see there that big jump in the number of cases fairly recently. So. Otherwise, just a general comparison here. Which one's fairly mild is the rubella, German measles, and the true measles or red measles is the more extensive, more virulent form that can cause a variety of complications. So we mentioned encephalitis. There's also something that they call SSPE, or subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, which is one of the most severe versions of that disease.